In December 1942, thousands of men spent the most symbolic day of the year in a place already known as hell. And the most disturbing part wasn't that they were in combat. It was that, by then, it felt normal. Guadalcanal was not just a remote island in the Pacific. It was a point where control of the sky, the sea, and survival itself collided, turning every single day into a continuous physical and psychological trial. By the time the calendar reached December, the campaign had already dragged on for months, leaving bodies exhausted, units depleted, and a constant sense of siege that never truly shut off. While the world spoke of peace, faith, and hope, these soldiers lived under suffocating heat, tropical disease, daily losses, and the certainty that the war would not respect sacred dates. And yet, Christmas arrived, not as a celebration, but as a test. What did Christmas mean on a battlefield that never paused? And when the meal ended and the prayers stopped, what was left to steady the mind when the war simply continued? To answer this, we have to go back to the beginning and understand why the Pacific War was already hell before Christmas ever arrived. Guadalcanal mattered because it was not just an island. It sat in a part of the Pacific where air power and sea lanes decided everything. Who could move troops, who could feed an army, who could protect supply routes, who could threaten the next objective. That is why the campaign became the Allies' first major land push in the Pacific, and why it carried such strategic weight from the start. The operation began on August 7, 1942, and it did not resolve quickly. It stretched for roughly 6 months, ending only when Japanese forces abandoned the island on February 3, 1943. That timeline matters, because it means Christmas 1942 arrived not at the beginning of the ordeal, but deep inside it, after months of fear, stress, and attrition had already reshaped the men living there. The siege involved U.S. Marines as the central ground force, but it also pulled in every branch of the U.S. military, turning Guadalcanal into a grinding, multi-layered fight. And the fighting was only part of what made Guadalcanal hell. The environment was its own weapon. The tropics meant heat that stayed oppressive even when the sun went down. The sources emphasize the detail that Santa walked around in shorts because it was about 90 degrees, a small, almost absurd image that still reveals the larger truth. This was a battlefield where the climate constantly pressed on the body, draining energy and patience. Even when the soldiers wasn't being shot at, the island worked on him. Sweat, insects, infections, tropical illness, and the slow erosion of strength that comes from living wet, tired, and exposed. By December 1942, the cost was already measurable in hard numbers, and those numbers explain the psychological pressure better than any metaphor. On the American side, 1,592 were killed in action, and another 4,183 wounded, with many more suffering from tropical diseases. On the Japanese side, the toll was even higher, with 14,800 killed in action. These figures are more than statistics. They represent how normal it had become for men to disappear, to be wounded, to be evacuated, or to simply stop functioning. Christmas did not arrive into a stable unit. It arrived into units that had been chewed down by months of loss. Now, add the mental strain. A siege is a particular kind of war. It is not a single battle with a clear beginning and end, but an extended state of threat. The sources describe Guadalcanal as war was indeed hell, and that framing is key because it tells you how the soldiers themselves and the observers understood the place. It was not a theater where you could reset. It was a landscape where the nervous system stayed switched on for too long. A holiday in that setting doesn't feel like a holiday. It feels like a reminder of what you no longer have: predictability, safety, sleep, and the ordinary calendar of life. Back home, Americans were living a parallel version of that same calendar, a holiday season shadowed by war. December 1942 carried the one-year anniversary of Pearl Harbor, and the tone on the home front reflected that. Newspapers and reports captured the contradiction. The language of peace and goodwill existing inside homes and churches, while empty chairs at dinner tables marked the absence of loved ones far away. President Franklin D. Roosevelt's Christmas message, as quoted, carries the same tension. He speaks of not being able to say Merry Christmas without thinking constantly of soldiers and sailors in combat, while still insisting that the Christmas star shines in a world darkened by war and hate. That's the emotional bridge between home and Guadalcanal. Hope spoken in safety, and hope tested under fire. So when you ask why that Christmas carried such extreme psychological weight, the answer sits in the collision of these realities. Guadalcanal was an early win for the Allies, but it was a win purchased in blood, wounds, and disease, and in exhaustion that didn't end when the sun went down. Meanwhile, the holiday itself was a global reminder of distance. Families at home marking Christmas with absences, and soldiers on the island marking Christmas with the absence of home itself. By the time December 25th arrived, Guadalcanal was not a fresh battlefield. It was a place already saturated with months of strain, a place where celebrating anything required a decision to fight for your own mind. If Guadalcanal had already taken that kind of physical and psychological toll by December 1942, what did Christmas even mean on an island like that? And more importantly, when the fighting doesn't pause, what exactly do soldiers hold onto to keep themselves human? By the time Christmas approached Guadalcanal in December 1942, no one expected comfort. What soldiers hoped for was something smaller and harder to define, a break in the mental pressure. Commanders understood this. Even in an active combat zone, they made deliberate efforts to acknowledge the holiday, not because it changed the war, but because it could stabilize men who had been stretched too far for too long. Christmas, in that sense, became a tool of morale rather than celebration. Any preparation depended entirely on circumstance. Guadalcanal was still under threat, and supply lines were fragile. There was no guarantee that anything extra could arrive on time. Still, attempts were made to send foods tied to Christmas traditions back home. According to the Navy Bureau of Supplies and Accounts, turkeys were sent to Guadalcanal in plenty of time to get there, though officials admitted they had no direct confirmation from the island. The effort itself mattered, proof that someone, somewhere, was still thinking in terms of normal life. When the food did arrive, it carried weight far beyond nutrition. Photographs from the campaign show soldiers preparing turkeys, cutting pies, and organizing communal meals with whatever equipment they had available. These were not decorated dining halls, but rough outdoor setups or makeshift mess areas. For men used to monotonous rations and uncertainty, a meal that resembled Christmas back home became a rare psychological anchor. The symbolic power of that meal cannot be overstated. Eating turkey and pie on Guadalcanal did not erase fear or fatigue, but it briefly interrupted the rhythm of survival. For a few hours, soldiers were not reacting to gunfire or waiting for orders. They were sitting, chewing, talking, remembering. In a war defined by motion and noise, stillness itself became meaningful. Religion offered another form of structure. Christmas services were held wherever space allowed, often under tents or open skies. Chaplains led midnight masses, attended by soldiers who arrived still wearing helmets and combat gear. The ceremonies were simple, stripped of ornamentation, but that simplicity matched the environment. These moments were not about spectacle, they were about grounding. Photographs of these services show rows of men standing quietly, faces serious, bodies rigid from habit. Around them, the war remained fully present. Yet for a short time, the sounds of combat were replaced by prayer and song. The silence did not mean safety. It meant focus. A pause carved out of chaos. One of the most striking images from that Christmas is the improvised Santa Claus. In Guadalcanal's tropical heat, Santa wore shorts instead of winter clothes and a military helmet instead of a red cap. He moved through camps and field hospitals in a Chevrolet captured from Japanese forces, distributing gifts supplied by the Red Cross. The image is almost surreal, but it captures the adaptive logic of the front. Tradition, reshaped to survive, the gifts themselves were modest, but for wounded soldiers they carried disproportionate meaning. A visit from Santa in a field hospital was not about fantasy. It was about recognition. It signaled that the injured were not invisible, that they still belonged to a larger world beyond the island. In a campaign where men were constantly lost, that acknowledgement mattered. What soldiers lacked most during that Christmas was family. The only family available was the one created under fire. Guadalcanal forced men into intense proximity, dependence, and shared risk. Over months of fighting, that proximity hardened into bonds that resembled family ties, not sentimental, but functional and deeply emotional. Christmas intensified that awareness. This found family shaped how the holiday was experienced. Soldiers ate together, prayed together, and endured together. The absence of parents, spouses, and children sharpened the value of the men standing beside them. In Guadalcanal, companionship was not a comfort, it was survival. Christmas simply made that truth impossible to ignore. The photographs taken by life photographer Ralph Morse capture this dynamic clearly. Soldiers cluster close, smiling despite exhaustion, sharing food and brief moments of levity. The energy in these images does not suggest joy in the conventional sense. It suggests relief, gratitude for being alive, for being together, for having endured long enough to see the day arrive at all. In that context, Christmas was not nostalgia. It was maintenance. A psychological reset measured in hours, not days. It did not promise safety or victory. It offered something more limited but essential. The reminder that the men on Guadalcanal were still human beings, not just bodies occupying a battlefield, and if Christmas on Guadalcanal functioned only as a fragile psychological pause, a few hours carved out of months of violence, what happened when that pause ended? And how quickly did the war reclaim the day meant to symbolize peace? Any illusion that Christmas might slow the war on Guadalcanal was quickly shattered by reality. The island remained an active combat zone, and military operations continued without interruption through Christmas Eve and Christmas Day. The calendar had no authority over the campaign. Men who had attended a Christmas service or shared a holiday meal were often back on duty within hours. In late December 1942, American forces used Guadalcanal as a launching point for continued offensive operations. Navy fighters and B-24 Liberator bombers took off from Henderson Field to strike Japanese positions at Munda, on New Georgia Island. According to a Navy spokesman, United States aircraft bombed and strafed the airfield and shore installations on Munda, engaging enemy aircraft both in the air and on the ground. These missions were carried out during the Christmas period, underscoring that the fighting did not pause for tradition. The Christmas Eve attack on Munda was not symbolic, it was tactical. Over the course of the operation, 14 Japanese fighter planes sent up to defend the base were shot down, while additional aircraft were destroyed on the ground. All American planes returned safely to Guadalcanal after completing the mission. For the crews involved, Christmas meant long flights, combat stress, and the same risks faced on any other day. The consequences extended into Christmas Day itself. The clearing of the Munda airfield allowed American bombers to launch further operations against Rabaul, a key center of Japanese defense in the South Pacific. Flying fortresses departed from Guadalcanal and struck targets hundreds of miles away, landing direct hits on enemy shipping. These actions made clear that Christmas existed alongside escalation, not suspension. This reality stood in stark contrast to the messages coming from home. In the United States, Christmas addresses and newspaper columns spoke of hope, faith, and eventual victory. On Guadalcanal, soldiers received those words while continuing patrols, guarding positions, and preparing for further combat. The holiday did not soften the war. It simply revealed the distance between rhetoric and lived experience. For many soldiers, that contrast sharpened rather than dulled the moment. Christmas did not offer safety. It offered clarity. The war was still there when the meal ended, when the prayers stopped, when the sun rose on December 26th. Guadalcanal did not allow belief in a pause. It allowed only endurance. If Christmas on Guadalcanal ended the moment the missions resumed, if the war reclaimed the day without hesitation, then what lasting meaning, if any, did that Christmas actually leave behind for the men who lived through it? Christmas on Guadalcanal was never about comfort. It did not bring safety, relief, or certainty. What it offered was something narrower and more fragile, a temporary defense against psychological collapse. In an environment designed to exhaust the body and erode the mind, maintaining a ritual associated with home, faith, and family became a form of resistance. Not against the enemy, but against despair. The soldiers who marked Christmas on the island did so fully aware that the war would resume immediately, because it never truly stopped. Meals ended, prayers concluded, and aircraft continued to take off. The holiday did not interrupt the campaign, nor did it soften its brutality. Instead, it exposed a deeper truth about survival in prolonged combat. Meaning had to be actively constructed, even when conditions offered none. This is why the phrase "Christmas in Hell" endures. It does not describe irony or spectacle, but contradiction. A moment of tradition unfolding in a place defined by violence. A reminder of humanity existing inside a system built to erase it. Guadalcanal's Christmas did not change the outcome of the battle, but it revealed the inner terrain of the men fighting it, their need to remember who they were beyond uniforms and orders. In the broader history of the Pacific War, Guadalcanal stands as an early and costly turning point. Christmas stands as something else entirely. Proof that even in the most unforgiving conditions, soldiers sought not peace, but meaning. And sometimes, meaning was the difference between enduring and breaking.